Reality feels solid. That isn't something most people question. It feels immediate, obvious, reliable. You wake up and the world is already there. The floor holds your weight. The chair supports your body. Walls stay where you left them. Nothing about this feels mysterious. In fact, solidity feels like one of the few things in life that doesn't need explaining. You don't wonder whether the ground will catch you. You assume it will. Your body trusts the world completely. That trust didn't come from physics. It came from evolution. Over millions of years, the human nervous system learned to treat stability as the default. Not because the universe is simple, but because simplicity keeps organisms alive. A world that felt unstable would be impossible to navigate. So your perception smooths things out. It compresses complexity. It hides constant motion and turns processes into things. This happens so automatically that we rarely notice it. But when physicists describe reality, they don't talk about solid objects. They talk about interactions, fields, probabilities, and relationships. A very different picture from the one your senses present. And yet both descriptions refer to the same universe. So the real question isn't whether reality is solid. It's why it feels solid at all. Take a moment and notice how automatic this feeling is. You don't check whether the floor will hold you. You don't test the walls. You move through the world as if stability is guaranteed. That assumption runs deep. Your brain learned long ago that reliable patterns are worth trusting. Objects that remain where they were yesterday are easier to survive around. So your perception favors continuity over accuracy. This doesn't mean your senses are lying. It means they're simplifying. At every moment, your nervous system filters out enormous amounts of information. It ignores microscopic motion. It discards fluctuations. It prioritizes what stays the same, because what stays the same is useful. So reality becomes a set of stable surfaces and solid forms, a dependable environment, a place where action feels safe. But underneath that stability, things are not still. They never have been. Atoms vibrate. Particles fluctuate. Fields shift constantly. Nothing in the universe is truly frozen in place. Stability is not a fundamental feature of reality. It's a pattern that persists long enough for consciousness to label it. And that label becomes experience. At the smallest scales we can measure, matter is mostly empty space, not metaphorically, literally. If an atom were the size of a stadium, the nucleus would be smaller than a grain of sand at the center. The rest would be distance. Vast, mostly unoccupied distance. And yet you cannot move your hand through a table. So where does solidity come from? Not from tightly packed matter, but from interaction. From forces that repel long before anything touches. Your nervous system interprets those forces as resistance, as hardness, as form. You don't experience the underlying processes. You experience the result, which is why solidity feels real. Because it works. It allows you to move, plan, and act without hesitation. It gives you a world that feels reliable enough to live in. But reliability is not the same as fundamental truth. And as we move forward, we're going to explore how something that is not solid at all can still feel absolutely real, not by accident, but by design. When we say something is solid, we usually mean something very simple. It doesn't let other things pass through it. A wall stops you from walking forward. A table supports your weight. The ground doesn't give way beneath your feet. From a human perspective, this feels like a basic fact about the world. Some things move. Some things don't. Some things are solid. But this definition doesn't come from physics. It comes from experience. Solidity, as you experience it, is not a statement about what something is. It's a statement about how something behaves when you interact with it. That distinction matters more than it seems. Because behavior can emerge from many different underlying causes. And when we look closely, solidity turns out to be an effect, not a substance. From the outside, a rock feels firm and unmoving. From the inside, it is anything but still. Atoms vibrate. Structures flex. Energy moves constantly. Yet your experience collapses all of that motion into a single idea. This is solid, not because the motion isn't there, but because it doesn't matter at your scale. Human perception evolved at a very specific size and speed. You are not built to notice atomic vibration. You are not built to track submicroscopic motion. You are built to notice what changes enough to affect your survival. So your senses draw a boundary. Anything that resists your movement consistently gets labeled as solid. Anything that yields easily gets labeled as soft, liquid, or air. This categorization is practical, not precise. It's a shortcut. The brain does not ask what reality is made of. It asks what it can rely on. If something remains where it was yesterday, supports your body today, and behaves the same way tomorrow, your nervous system treats it as stable, and stability becomes solidity. This is why solidity feels obvious. It's reinforced every moment you move through the world. But obvious does not mean fundamental. Solidity is a summary your brain creates. After observing repeated patterns of resistance and support, it is a conclusion, not a property written into the universe. There's another reason solidity feels so convincing. Scale. Human perception is tuned to a very narrow range of sizes and speeds. Too small, and motion disappears. Too large, and change feels permanent. At the scale you live in, stability dominates. Mountains don't move. Buildings don't ripple. Tables don't vibrate. Not because they aren't changing, but because their change happens outside the window your senses evolved to detect. A mountain is moving, just not fast enough for you to notice. A table is vibrating, just not in a way that matters to your nervous system. So solidity becomes the default interpretation. Your senses are not wrong. They are optimized. They show you what remains consistent at your scale and hide everything else. This is why solidity feels universal. It's not that the universe is built out of solid things. It's that solid behavior dominates at human size. Change becomes background noise. Stability becomes foreground reality. And once something stays consistent long enough, the brain stops questioning it. It becomes what the world is. But this sense of certainty only holds as long as we don't look too closely. Because the moment we change scale, the moment we zoom in, the idea of solidity begins to dissolve. And that's where we're headed next. To understand why solidity is not as straightforward as it feels, we need to change scale. Not dramatically, just enough to look beneath the surface. Every solid object around you is made of atoms. And atoms are not small. Hard pieces packed tightly together. They are mostly empty space. This isn't a metaphor. It's a measurement. At the center of every atom is a nucleus dense, compact, and tiny. Around it exists a region where electrons are likely to be found. But between those regions, there is no solid material filling the gaps. If an atom were expanded to the size of a stadium, the nucleus would be smaller than a grain of sand at the center. Everything else would be distance. And yet, when you touch a table, your hand does not pass through it. That contradiction is where the story gets interesting. The idea that matter is mostly empty can feel abstract, because emptiness usually implies weakness or absence. But in physics, empty space is not inactive. It is structured. Fields exist throughout space. Forces act across it. Energy moves through it continuously. So when we say atoms are mostly empty, we don't mean they are fragile or insubstantial. We mean that what gives matter its structure is not the amount of material present, but the relationships that organize it. Solidity does not come from fullness. It comes from arrangement. Stable patterns can emerge even when the underlying components are separated by enormous relative distances. This is why emptiness does not translate to softness. Structure does not require density. It requires consistency. Once we see this, the intuition we built earlier starts to shift. Solidity no longer feels like a fundamental trait of objects. It feels like an outcome, an effect produced by invisible structure. The atoms in a table are not pressed tightly together. They are held in place by relationships that repeat reliably. Your experience of firmness comes from interacting with those relationships, not from colliding with solid substance. This is the moment where our everyday intuition and physical reality quietly diverge. At human scale, solidity dominates experience. At atomic scale, emptiness dominates structure. Both are true. They simply belong to different levels of description. And now that we've seen the structure, we're ready to understand the mechanism, which brings us back to force. Up to this point, we've talked about solidity as something you experience. Now, we need to be more precise. Because solidity is not made of matter pressing against matter. In fact, at the smallest scales, matter never actually touches. When you place your hand on a table, the atoms in your hand do not collide with the atoms in the table. They never meet. What stops your hand is something far less intuitive. Force, more specifically, electromagnetic repulsion. Every atom contains electrons, and electrons carry electric charge. When the electrons in your hand approach the electrons in the table, their electric fields repel each other. That repulsion happens long before any physical contact could occur. What you feel as hardness is your nervous system interpreting that repulsion as resistance. Solidity is not contact. It is interaction. And that distinction quietly changes everything, because it means the surface of an object is not a boundary where matter ends. It's a region where forces become strong enough to prevent further motion. The table doesn't stop your hand because it is solid all the way through. It stops your hand because invisible forces say, "No further." This idea can feel strange at first. We're used to thinking of objects as compact and filled. But from a physical perspective, what matters is not how much matter is present, but how forces behave at close range. Electromagnetic forces are incredibly strong. They dominate the structure of atoms, molecules, and materials. They determine why solids hold their shape, why liquids flow, why gases spread out. Solidity emerges when these forces lock particles into stable arrangements, not because the space is filled, but because motion is constrained. Your experience of firmness comes from limits on movement. Push harder, and resistance increases. Pull away, and the interaction vanishes. Nothing is gripping your hand. Nothing is holding it in place. The forces simply respond to proximity. This is why solidity feels immediate and absolute. Forces act instantly at your scale. There is no delay for perception to interpret. Resistance appears as certainty, but certainty here is not substance. It's behavior. This also explains something subtle. Why solidity disappears when conditions change. Heat is solid, and it softens. Add enough energy, and it melts. Add more, and it vaporizes. The matter hasn't vanished. The forces haven't stopped existing. What's changed is how tightly motion is constrained. As energy increases, particles gain freedom. The same interactions are still present, but they no longer produce rigidity. Solidity is not a permanent feature. It is a temporary balance, a moment where forces align in a way that restricts motion just enough to feel firm and stable. Your senses translate that balance into a simple experience. This is solid, but underneath that simplicity is a dynamic system constantly adjusting. Nothing frozen, nothing static, just forces, relationships, and limits on motion. And once we understand that, solidity stops being mysterious. Not because it's less impressive, but because it's more subtle than it appears. So far, we've talked about solidity as structure and force, but none of that explains the most important part: experience. Because forces don't feel solid on their own. Fields don't feel hard. Interactions don't feel like surfaces. Something has to translate them. That something is the brain. Your nervous system does not directly perceive atoms, forces, or fields. It receives signals: pressure, vibration, resistance, and constructs meaning from them. When electromagnetic forces resist motion, your brain turns that resistance into sensation. Pressure becomes hardness. Consistency becomes stability. Repeated interaction becomes certainty. Solidity is not something the world hands to you fully formed. It is something your brain assembles in real time. This assembly happens automatically, beneath awareness, so it feels immediate and unquestionable. But it is still an interpretation, a remarkably effective one, but an interpretation nonetheless. The brain's job is not accuracy, it is usefulness. Your perception is optimized for action, not for revealing the true nature of reality. You don't experience raw data. You experience a simplified model that updates constantly. This model prioritizes what resists you, what supports you, what remains consistent. Anything that behaves reliably gets treated as solid. Anything unpredictable gets flagged as potential danger. Over time, this model becomes so familiar that it fades into the background. You stop noticing that you are interpreting it all. The world feels directly present, but neuroscience tells us something different. Perception is not passive reception. It is active construction. Your brain predicts what it expects to feel and corrects itself when it's wrong. Most of the time, it's right enough. So, solidity feels obvious, not because it's fundamental, but because the prediction works. This is why solidity feels so emotionally convincing. It's tied to trust. A solid world feels safe, reliable, navigable. Your nervous system relaxes in environments where predictions keep coming true. Walls stay walls. Floors stay floors. So, solidity becomes more than a physical experience. It becomes psychological. It reassures you that the world makes sense. But the moment prediction fails, when things break, collapse, or behave, unexpectedly, that sense of solidity cracks. Not just physically, but mentally, which tells us something important. Solidity is not just about matter or force. It's about expectation. It's about a brain learning that certain patterns can be depended on. And once that dependence forms, the experience feels indistinguishable from reality itself. This doesn't make solidity an illusion. It makes it a collaboration between the structure of the universe and the way consciousness interprets it. The universe provides patterns. Forces provide constraints. The brain provides meaning. Solidity lives at the intersection. It is not fully out there in the world and not fully inside the mind. It exists in the relationship between the two. And once we see that, the question begins to change. Instead of asking, "Is reality solid?" we begin asking, "How much of reality is shaped by the way it's experienced?" That question doesn't weaken science. It deepens it, and it prepares us for what comes next. We started with something simple, the feeling that reality is solid, stable, reliable, and we followed that feeling inward. We saw that solidity is not a basic ingredient of the universe. It's not something matter is made of. It's something that emerges from structure, from force, from repeated patterns that hold long enough for a nervous system to trust them. Atoms are mostly empty space. Forces prevent collapse. The brain turns resistance into experience. None of this removes solidity from your life. You will still sit in chairs, walk on floors, lean against walls. The world will continue to feel firm and dependable. But now there's a subtle shift. Solidity no longer feels like a mystery you're trapped inside. It feels like a process you're participating in, a collaboration between the universe and the way it's perceived. And once you see that, another question naturally arises. If solidity is not fundamental, what else about reality might be shaped by the way it's experienced? Time, self, presence, continuity. Physics describes a universe in motion. Consciousness experiences a world that feels still. Somewhere between those two descriptions, experience takes form. In the next part, we'll step beyond structure and force and look more closely at that interface, at how observation, awareness, and expectation shape what feels real, not to dissolve reality, but to understand it more clearly. For now, there's nothing to solve, nothing to hold on to, just the recognition that the world doesn't need to be solid in order to feel real. And that understanding, quietly, changes the way everything else is seen.